So how do you measure your warehouse productivity? What are some of the KPIs that you use? How do you know what a good target is? That's the question that we're going to be posing this week to one of our warehouse specialists, John Monck, coming right up. So everybody's trying to improve their warehouse productivity, and sometimes people get a little bit confused over what should we measure and what should be the target that we're trying to achieve. So John, welcome back. Great to have you. John Monck is one of our specialist warehouse consultants here at Logistics Bureau. And I know that warehouse productivity is a bit of a passion of yours. So maybe you could give us a few thoughts on what sort of KPIs are really important to measure.
Thank you, Rob. There's published KPIs often within a warehouse in terms of the performance. If I focus on the productivity aspects of a warehouse, of course, for a logistics manager or a warehouse manager, usually there's the two big ones are what we call perfect order and cost. But if we drill down below that into sort of the productivity level, which is probably where I'm going to discuss today, is monitoring at each stage of the operation within a warehouse, what the KPIs might look like. And so these would be, if we talk about the operations, is receiving and checking perhaps and staging, put away, replenishment, picking, checking again, dispatch. So those steps, each of those can have KPIs. The one KPI that most warehouse managers would measure would be picking productivity, lines picked per person per hour, or cases picked per person per hour. These would be very typical lines, and in fact, pickers are probably the most measured function within a warehouse. And some of the other areas, what we often find when we start to look at and benchmark the direct labour within a warehouse is we whip our pickers and we don't necessarily monitor some of those other functions like receiving and dispatch as closely as perhaps we should be. And so what we look at is we build a direct labour model and look at each of those functions, which we calibrate specifically to a warehouse operation and come up with a performance measure. Typically, for a best performing company, we normally target around 90%. But if we see it, once we've calibrated it at 85, then we've got various aspects we can look at within that model and make adjustments for continuous improvement.
So when you're saying 90% or 85%, can you explain what that measure is?
With the measurement of direct labour within a warehouse, we're talking about engineered labour standards here. So this is typically how long does it take to do a particular task. If it's moving a pallet from A to B, it might be lining up the forklifts on the forklift, the times on a forklift. It's lifting up the pallet. It's accelerating, to the travel speed that you're going to travel at. Then getting to the destination, turning the forklift, placing it away. So all of this from an engineered labour standard perspective can be measured. We can go in with a stopwatch and a piece of paper and do a method study. Often there will be businesses will do surveys to get a typical average of how long does a particular task take. There are rules of thumbs that we use in consulting to understand how long a particular task takes. Well, what we do within Logistics Bureau is we build a direct labour model that we can actually measure all these tasks, and they're using databases that have all these various constants. So we adjust for things like the product Pareto profile, the 80-20 rule there. It could be 90-10, it could be 70-30. Okay. So they're the type of
So when you say we're looking for 90%, we want to be 90% of the standard.
Yes.
Yeah, gotcha.
Yeah, okay. 90% of the standard is where we sort of see the best-in-class businesses operate.
That's great.
And then, of course, there's always variations, but that's what the model takes into account. Is like if you're, like if I do a rule of thumb, I might say I can move 25 pallets an hour in put away. But the reality is it depends on how far you're traveling. And so that's what we calibrate for. Gotcha. Some businesses will use different equipment. So that's what we calibrate for in our model. And then we look at where the opportunities are for improvement.
I mean, it's interesting. I often get lots of questions, online on our YouTube channels and blogs and so on about, what's the sort of productivity figure I ought to aim for? How many lines an hour or how many cases an hour and all the rest of it. But there, like you say, there are so many variables. You've really got to tailor it to the particular operation, haven't you?
Yeah. So when you start talking about those sort of KPIs, we can take industry standards, but there's always so that gives you a guide. That sort of says, how do you compare against the average, or how do you compare against best in class? How do you compare? You're above or below. Do you have opportunities, or no, you don't? But then when you actually get specifically into your operation, then you need to sort of be specific about, well, what's acceptable in our operation? Lines picked per hour, for example, which is definitely a measure used across many warehouses for pickers. Can we improve it? And then how do we improve it? And, having the vision to, like I used to work in a fast-moving consumer goods company, and one of my previous mentors, he's had this a mantra of halve it. How do we halve the time to do it? And, that's the challenge that you set yourself to say, how do we improve?
It's interesting. I think we've got a video about it on this channel, but we did a case study on some work that we did with a client many years ago. And I can remember they were in an industry where it was really ugly products, big, heavy, all the rest of it. And they were currently picking at 15 lines an hour, which, people watching this go, what? That's terrible. But, there were big, heavy, awkward items. And I can remember we showed them through a benchmarking process that actually the best in class for their industry was at about 50 and the average was 30, which they found hard to believe. But over a sort of continuous improvement process of about 18 months, they actually got up beyond 50 lines an hour. So I think for me, the big lesson there is that whatever your current productivity figures, it's very easy to become complacent and think, but we're different and it will be hard for us to improve, but there's always room for improvement. And I think that's probably the greatest benefit, isn't it, from, you've called it engineer standards, or benchmarking or comparisons, comparing yourself with other similar organizations. It shows you how much better you could be.
Definitely, Robert. Look, I think the opportunity again for our viewers is, are they measuring some of these things? And often I find businesses that aren't, but it's not that difficult in the end to say, well, approximately how many people have you got picking and how many lines did they pick today? Because we can get all the number of lines from the sales information, and that just gives you that starting point. And then you can compare it to some, as you say, industry standards, like you're talking about before. So at least that gives you a pulse check of, do I need to look further? And if you're, as you say, if the average is 50 and they're picking at 15, well, clearly they should be looking at it. And as I say, the tool set that the Logistics Bureau use is we go into sort of more detail as specifically challenge themselves about how can they improve that. Okay.
Maybe we should do a follow-up video at some point and actually get into that a lot more detail and maybe look at some of the tools that you use. And, there's always people watching this who say, that's great, but show us the detail. So perhaps we could do that in the future. But, for now, I think you've certainly opened our eyes a bit, John. And, as we always try to do in the description below the video, I'll see what links we can provide to similar material. We might have articles on this topic, other videos on the topic, and we'll put those links there. If someone's particularly concerned about their warehouse productivity, maybe you wouldn't mind, John, if we put your LinkedIn link down below the video. And if people are particularly worried about it, they can contact you and have a chat as well.
But I'll leave our viewers with the thought that if you don't measure it, you're not managing it. So you've got to measure it. That's the first thing, is try and measure it so you can manage it. But if you don't do that, then you just don't know, do you?
I'd add another line to that. Not only make sure you measure it, but then question the result and say, is that good or bad?
Yeah,
or do I even know?
Yeah, for sure.
Really question it. I remember that example of, they thought they were doing well at 15 lines an hour and then they got up to over 50, which was incredible. Great. Thank you for joining us again, John. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next week. Bye for now.